Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Todd Higgins, and I'm the director of Gallaudet's University Regional Center in the Eastern Region. We are located at Northern Essex Community College in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Welcome. We are thrilled to have you join us for this evening's webinar. Before we begin our presentation, I just want to share a few things related to accessibility. This presentation will be given in spoken English. The presenter will be using spoken English with a sign language interpreter on a separate screen. Interpretation will also be available in Spanish. So if you need Spanish interpretation, you can click on the globe icon that says interpretation at the bottom menu of your screen and select the Spanish option. If you need any tech support, feel free to use the chat box to send a message to Adri, who is on our staff, and she'll be happy to provide that support to you. Now I will begin with an introduction. Today's presenter, Dr. Shane Blau, is a hearing researcher who does research and studies sign language linguistics and acquisition, specifically related to children. He's been involved in the deaf community since the age of 16, when he took his first American Sign Language class at the Learning Center, which is in Framingham, Massachusetts. He received his undergraduate degree in Deaf Studies from Boston University in 1999. He then received a master's degree in linguistics from Gallaudet University in 2012. While at Gallaudet, he conducted research on language acquisition, which became an opportunity to work for 3 years in the Cognitive Neurolinguistics Lab at the Center for Brain at Gallaudet University. At the Neurolinguistics Lab at the Center for the Mind and Brain at UC Davis, rather. He had a PhD in linguistics at Gallaudet University in 2023, and he currently is doing a postdoc at the University of Connecticut with the Family ASL Project. He also teaches language acquisition and linguistics at Gallaudet and Ohlone. He focuses specifically in his PhD about infant sensitivity and their earliest experiences that have effect on their attention to language. Dr. Blau is currently working as a postdoc at the University of Connecticut in Storrs, Connecticut. He's involved with the Family ASL Project. This project looks at how young deaf children who have hearing parents and how visual language is used to support language acquisition, both using ASL and English. He'll be sharing more information about that project and how some of you can become involved. He also teaches language acquisition and linguistics at Gallaudet, at both Gallaudet and Ohlone College in Fremont, California. Welcome, Dr. Blau.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you very much for having me here tonight. I am going to go through a couple of things. So there's a few points that I'm kind of using to structure what I'm going to talk about tonight. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is what we know about early language in the brain. What do we know about how language is acquired in general? What do we know from research in the field? And then I'm going to go from there to talking about how this applies to deaf children specifically. So we've got general research on language. What do we know more specifically about sign languages and deaf children and their early experiences? And then the most important part, I think, talking about family involvement. So that is how we have this research information. We have certain things we know about languages in general, about deaf children. How can we use that information? And that is a lot of what my work is about. That's a lot of where I'm putting my time and energy, because we know a lot of really interesting things in academic fields. And I would love to see that information out in the world being used in ways that it has impacts on people's lives. So that is one of the things that I'll really be talking about today. Um, I am hearing, I'm not from a deaf family, so I'm a second language signer. I learned ASL, as a late teenager, mostly in college and in my adult life. It is challenging to acquire a second language. And, I'm acknowledging that as a hearing person, there are times when the journey has been quite challenging. But I've had these amazing opportunities to work with deaf scholars and deaf researchers, and that has really guided my research in some interesting directions. So I'm going to try to take what I've learned about language and brains and deaf children, and share it with you in a way that works, for how families actually interact and what sorts of language happen in the family. So when we look at early language, I'm talking very early, as soon as a baby is born. Um, Newborn babies are extremely sensitive to language patterns. And sometimes people don't realize that because they're not producing language yet. So brand new babies, they don't seem like they're doing very much in terms of language. They're not saying anything, they're not even babbling. They maybe are crying or whatever, but you're not seeing a lot of interaction yet. So people don't realize that their brains have actually started doing a lot of work. And one of the things that we've learned from research is that at birth, hearing babies, if they hear two different spoken languages, they can tell that those two languages are different languages. And they are doing this, they're not using strategies. So they're not thinking about this language and that language. This is something much more fundamental. Their brains are made to be extremely sensitive to language patterns. And let me give you an example of kind of what sort of things their brains are paying attention to at this age. So babies, imagine that this is an American baby being exposed to American English, a hearing baby. They're going to hear a lot of sounds. They're just going to hear language in the world around them. And people don't usually speak in just single words, right? They're going to speak in continuous language. So at some point, the baby is very likely to hear the sound combination big. So bi and then ig, right? So that word is going to come up pretty frequently in American English. You hear big. So the baby knows, okay, bi and I can go together. And I and gi can go together. That's good in my language. And then they might hear another word pretty frequently. Maybe they hear dog a lot. Uh, and so they know that duh and ah can go together. And they know that ah and g can go together. So they hear those sounds come together every time they hear the word dog. What they don't hear a lot of is the g sound followed by the duh sound. Because in English, we don't have words that start with gduh. Other languages may, but English doesn't. And that means that we don't hear those sounds next to each other very often. Now, the reason I'm explaining this is because, amazingly enough, babies are actually calculating statistical probabilities on the sounds that they hear in language. So their little baby brains are doing amazing, like supercomputer work. They are taking in language and they are figuring out B's and D's can be followed by vowel sounds. We don't like it to be followed by a g sound or any of these other sounds. My language doesn't like that. And those language patterns start to make their way into the baby's brain. Now, you might be not super impressed that a baby can tell the difference between languages. And, the example I gave on that first slide, it was a French word and a German word. And you can probably hear the difference between French and German if you listen to it yourself. But I want to give you a chance to try this skill out with languages you may not have heard before. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play you two short clips of languages. So for one, you'll hear two different short clips of language, and then you'll have a chance to respond in a poll. And I'm sorry, I just saw a comment. I'm happy to provide a copy of my slides. So you don't need to take notes or screen captures. I'm happy to share these slides. Thank you for the question. So you'll hear a pair of languages, and then a poll will come up and it will ask you, were those languages the same language or different languages? Once you've answered that, I'm going to play you another set of two, and then you will also get another chance to answer, do you think that they were the same two languages or two different languages? And then in the end, there's going to be a question that says, how many different languages do you think you heard? So you heard 4 language samples altogether. Were they all the same language? Were there 4 different languages? So you can answer, do you think you heard 1, 2, 3, or 4 languages? Okay, this is very brief. I just want to give you a sense of kind of what this feels like. So I am going to stop my screen share for a minute and pull up a different video, or pull up the samples. Okay, so this is there is a transcript available. So if any deaf audience members are curious, I did my best to transcribe what people are hearing. It is not exact. It's not perfect. And there are sounds that we can't represent in written English. So this is pretty rough, but it will give you a sense. And also remember that written representations of language are different than hearing it. So if you are going to listen to the samples, I would recommend don't look at the transcript to start off. All right, so with all that said, here is your first language sample.
Kituhtia manon kaniyo sitsigia. Meptenikin stuhtino. Samun bakakaya simuya. Muimtenikin tuhtino. Magauya kani hiewit. Terkamo atapno. Kintuhtino. Egotiktas.
Okay, that was one. And then here is your second sample for this pair. Okay, so those were 2 language samples. Now, do you think you heard 2 of the same language from different people, or do you think you heard 2 different languages? Okay, so poll should have popped up. You can just go ahead and decide if you think they were the same or different. Okay, and nobody needs to be thinking too hard about this. Now I'm going to play the second 2 clips. So here is the second pair. Okay, so I see the results on the first one. We had about 70% of people said it was different. About 30% of people said it was the same. I will give you the answers at the end. All right, so here is your second language sample, clip 1. Okay, and here is the second sample for this one. Okay, so now the poll should come up again. Do you think those 2 were the same or different languages? And then after that, go ahead and indicate how many different languages you think you heard. And while people are answering that, I will bring my slides back up. Okay. So let's see. I'm going to wait till the poll results come in just to see how people did. Okay, so with the second sample, it was a little more evenly split. 45% of people thought it was the same. 55% of people thought it was different. The answer was that the first two languages were different and the second two languages were different. But you actually heard the same language twice. So you heard Cree and Navajo in those two examples. They are from different language families, so they are at least as different as French and German, probably more. And my point there is just that telling languages apart when you don't know them is not actually a very easy task. And again, you as adults, you can use some strategies. You can say, well, I heard this sound, not this sound. That's not what babies are doing. Babies are just using their little pattern-seeking brains to actually recognize the rhythm and the shape of this language are different than this one. So that is a skill that brand new babies have. Now, what is the point of this extreme sensitivity? What is this doing for babies? This is what lets babies attend to the language information in their world to start finding the pieces they need to build the foundation. So when a baby first experiences language, it's just this continuous stream of information. Babies have to figure out, where do words start and end? What sounds are important and what sounds are someone coughing? Or, maybe this person has a slight accent. Is that the same language as this person's accent? Nobody is teaching babies these things. They are just figuring them out from language experience. And their brains are so extremely good at what they're trying to do that between birth and 1 year old, hearing babies have figured out the entire inventory of sounds that are used in their language, not only what sounds are used in their language, but how those sounds go together. So what sound combinations are allowed and what aren't. They use that skill to help themselves find word and phrase boundaries. Once they find boundaries to words and phrases, they can start to figure out how to build language. They're also extremely sensitive to rhythm, and they use rhythmic information to help them figure out when languages are different, especially in the beginning. So babies take in all of this information, and by the time they're 1 year old, they actually know even quite a bit about sentences. They understand relations in sentences. So if you say things like, the dog pushed the boy, we can actually test and we can see that at around 1, babies are starting to understand these sort of relationships between things based on language. So even though we don't always recognize it, babies in that first year of life are doing a lot of work. That first year is designed for perception. That first year is designed for the brain, which comes into the world not knowing what language it's going to experience, to adapt quickly to the language environment that a baby's in, and let them develop the language skills that they need to be ready to start talking in about a year. So by the time a baby has said their first words, they know many, many words. I see that someone asked, how do we know this about babies? That's a great question. The way we test babies' ability to do things based on biological responses, usually. So there's a number of things you can do. When something is new and interesting for a baby, their heart rate increases. If they're sucking on a pacifier, they start sucking on the pacifier more intensely. And they will shift their visual attention to things. So scientists use those clues to figure out what it is that babies can pay attention to. So in the example that I gave, if it was something like the dog pushed the boy, what a scientist might do is show a screen that has a dog on it and a boy on it, and probably has the dog pushing the boy in one picture and the boy pushing the dog in another picture. And then they have eye tracking. And as the child listens to that, they watch the kid's eyes. And if the kid is interpreting the sentence correctly, their eye gaze is going to follow and go to the dog pushing the boy, if that's what the sentence was. So that sort of visual attention is very frequently used. We also now have cool ways to look at brains, which tells us some stuff, but that technology is not only very new technology, it's also really hard to get babies to, lie really still when they're inside an MRI so that we can see their brains. So the neuroimaging techniques are telling us some really interesting things. But a lot of these methods that just use babies' attention and heart rate and other biological responses like that help us to know what it is that babies are paying attention to. So basically, this is kind of wrapping up the first part here. Early experience, what it tells us is that before babies do any producing, they're collecting information. They're finding patterns from natural language experience, and that's what builds their foundation that lets them acquire language from that point on. So now, sign languages. A lot of this research has been done with hearing babies and has been done on spoken languages, and that's taught us a lot of interesting stuff. But not a lot of people have looked at these same tasks in sign languages. That is a question I got interested in. I wanted to know, when babies watch sign languages, can they see the patterns of sign languages? Does it give them the structure that they need to extract language information from it and build a language foundation? Nobody had really tested that question before. So I decided that I would see. For my dissertation research, I found a man who was a fluent signer, deaf fluent signer of 2 different sign languages. So he signed Russian and German sign language fluently. I was able to use those videos and show them to a bunch of babies. I showed more than the numbers you see on the screen, but the number of babies whose information I ended up being able to use, I ended up with about 14 deaf babies that watched the videos and about 29 hearing babies that watched the videos. And I'll show you what it looked like when they were having this experience, so you get a little bit more of a sense of what this was like. What you're going to see is this is how I got babies interested. So what you're going to see is the things babies saw at the beginning. You'll see a person, my advisor, waving on one side of the screen, and then you'll see a little video that brings the kid's eye gaze back to center. Then you'll see a person, the same person waving on the other side of the screen, and then you'll see them come up on both sides. So I would do that until I could see that the baby was looking back and forth between the videos. Then I would bring their gaze back to center again and start the actual test videos. All right, so here's just a quick little sample of what that looked like. There, and then it goes into the language videos. It is difficult to find fluent bilingual signers. I was able to borrow these videos from a lab. They're not super exciting for children. They were made for adults. So there were certainly some kids who saw the fun video of someone waving and they thought that was really cool. And then this person came up who was kind of boring. But amazingly enough, a lot of babies were interested enough to keep watching. And I was able to find out some pretty interesting things. Whoops, didn't mean to play that again. Nope. Okay. So just like with the spoken languages, I'm going to give you guys a chance to try this out. You'll have a poll to answer again. So you're going to see 3 video clips. I'll show you each one twice, and the reason is that you're going to be seeing 2 sign languages at the same time, and it's hard to look back and forth. So if you want to look mostly at one side the first time and mostly at the other side the second time, that's fine. Each one is about 10 seconds long. I slowed it down a little bit, and like I said, I will play it for you twice. Okay, so here is your first example. Let me make sure it is slowed down. All right, I'm going to start it again, slowed down. Okay, I'm going to show you this one more time, and then you get to vote on whether you think that was the same or different languages. Okay, and a poll should come up. Let me get the next video set. Don't worry, this is the same one. You don't have to watch. All right, starting this again. All right, here's your second video pair. Again, I'll show it to you twice if I can get the play bar back at the beginning. Okay, on that first contrast, oh, I got to show you guys again. All right, one more time. All right, so that was your second pair. So go ahead and vote on yours on that second one. Do you think that was the same or different languages? And here is the last contrast. One more time with this one. Okay. So go ahead and vote on that one. Okay, beautiful. So the results that popped up for me were that, oh, I'm sorry, people are still responding to this last one. Okay, that was all right. So the first one that people saw, 75% of people thought they were different. The second one, about 60% of people thought they were different. And this third one was very 50-50. About 50% of people thought they were different. And the answers were, no, not that. That's the video again. Okay, so the first two were different. The middle one was two examples of the same language, and the third one was different, but in the other order. I see a really interesting question in the Q&A about codas and sign language, and I would love to talk about that, but probably I'll need to talk about that outside of this particular framework, so make sure you check in with me later. All right, so how did deaf adults do? We actually tested these same videos with deaf adults, and they were not great. Doing all of the videos, they didn't just have 3, but going through the entire set of videos, deaf adults were about 57% accurate at determining whether they were hearing the same or different language. So this is hard. This is a hard task. It's hard the first time you see a language. It's hard to kind of find the rhythm of it to really know what you're seeing. Now, how did the babies do when I showed the babies this video? They did really, really well. They had no problem at all seeing the difference. So out of the 12 deaf babies that watched the video, all of them except 2 showed clear evidence that they could see the difference between the languages. Out of the 29 or 28 hearing babies that participated, all except 3 showed really clear evidence that they could see the difference. Now, what was the evidence? The evidence was that they were making a choice to watch one language more than the other. So sometimes they would see Russian on the left, sometimes they would see Russian on the right. If over the course of the entire experiment, they were choosing to watch Russian more, the end result would be more eye gaze to that language. So I could look at each of the babies to see how long they spent watching each language over the entire length of the experiment and use that to tell me whether or not they were seeing the difference. There's more nuances to it than that, but that's the first step in the evaluation. I actually evaluated a lot of other pieces of their language perception, but for today, this is the most relevant piece, is that the babies were very, very good at seeing the difference between these 2 languages. So what does this mean? What does that little piece of research that I contributed to the field, what does that tell us? Well, that shows us that babies are very sensitive to sign languages, that they see the patterns in sign languages, just like hearing babies hear the patterns in spoken languages. And this was both deaf and hearing babies. This was some babies that had had sign experience, many, many babies that had no sign experience. They had no problem looking at 2 sign languages and recognizing that they were different languages. So that is a nice piece of evidence that shows us that sign language structure is not a problem for babies. Their brains recognize it just like they recognize spoken language structure. Now, that's just one little piece of research. And of course, there's lots of other people in the field who've been looking at questions like this too. So I want to share a few other pieces of information we know from research that sort of give a little bit of context to this. One thing that we know is that when we do use neuroimaging, sign languages and spoken languages look really similar in the brain. We've seen in a number of different research projects that a human brain that is processing sign language lights up just like a human brain that is processing spoken language. So when you're looking at a brain and seeing which parts of it are active, the language areas in the brain do not care if it was a spoken or a signed language. They're just looking for language. We also know, and this has been a concern for a lot of parents, we know that sign language doesn't harm or interfere with spoken language acquisition. And, people do have concerns. There's concerns if they sign, is that going to take the attention away from spoken language? There's also been some suggestions that it might actually change your brain if you sign so that you wouldn't be able to learn speech. None of those are true. So we have very solid evidence at this point that there's nothing about learning a sign language that makes you unable to acquire a spoken language later. We also see, when we look at language outcomes, deaf kids and language, that when kids have early sign experience, they tend to develop pretty on-target language, cognitive, academic, and social skills. That's also a nice piece of evidence that says when the brain has language, it does what it needs to do. And an interesting thing, not only does sign language not interfere with spoken language, we have a number of new research studies that are showing that it actually helps. That children who had sign language experience before they got a cochlear implant are doing better with their cochlear implants and spoken language outcomes than children who didn't have sign experience before. What that tells us is that it is that language foundation that is so important. Babies' brains have a lot of language work they are supposed to do in that first year. And when their brains get the information they need to, that sets up a foundation for future success in any language. Someone asked about how I measured whether they chose to watch one more or the other. So right, so I did measure actual looking time, but I also had some other pieces. I had some control experiments, some control trials where it would be the same language on both sides. And then I could compare how babies responded to the same language versus when they were different. So there were a lot of different things I ended up looking at with their eye gaze, and I'm happy to share more results about that at some point. And I see another question here talking about learning ASL separately from spoken. Actually, languages can be learned at the same time, and I will talk a little bit about that now as I kind of turn to strategies. Deaf babies can be bilingual, just like hearing babies can be bilingual. It's only in the US that we don't think of bilingualism as normal. In most of the world, people are bilingual. In the US, it's not quite as common. But we have seen very good evidence that deaf babies and deaf children can grow up bimodal, bilingual, so they can learn two languages at the same time that use different modalities. One that's a spoken and auditory language, and one that's a visual and manual language. So at this point, I'm going to turn from research findings to sort of applying this to families. And as I turn to this, I want to say something that I think is really important. You, parents in the audience, you are the person who knows your baby. You are the expert on your family. What you are giving your child is the absolute most important part of their development. So none of what I'm saying here is anything but me trying to share information from research. I think that sometimes parents with deaf children feel like they are not sure how to do what's best for their child, but I want to really encourage you to trust your parenting instincts. You are probably already doing many, many wonderful things for your child. Regardless of what's happening in terms of family language. But I want to talk about some ways to make the early language environment visual for babies. And one point is that language acquisition is a natural thing. Language acquisition should be fun. Babies, we don't teach them language. Babies acquire language from experience. So sometimes adults do think, oh, I taught my child how to speak. You didn't. You modeled language. You gave your baby language experience, and they figured the language out. That's what we're trying to encourage. We're trying to encourage children to have enough language experience that they can figure out the language themselves. And I have a little video here that I've been given permission to share, but please don't share it outside of this realm. You can use a copy of the slides, but this is a personal video that I was allowed to show. But so what you're going to see here is a deaf parent and his child, and the kid sees a squirrel out the window, and they talk about the squirrel. The only sign in the entire video is the sign squirrel. So watch this example, watch their eye gaze, watch how they interact with each other. It's a pretty cute example of natural language acquisition. So you can see there's a lot of interesting stuff here. You see the little kid made errors. He didn't say it right. He didn't sign the sign right. That's beautiful. That is a natural and beautiful part of language acquisition. Little hearing children don't say hard sounds correctly. Little deaf children don't sign hard signs correctly. That's part of acquiring a language. You also see that the dad can do something that we don't really do in spoken languages, which is actually help the child form the signs with his hands. And we see a lot of this really interesting visual attention. So we see that when the child is paying attention to the father is engaged the whole time. When the child looks away, the father also uses that opportunity. But as soon as the kid comes back, so does the father. And one of the other interesting things that you see here, and I just got some still shots here, is you see the father getting visual attention. So you see that when the baby is looking out the window, the father actually taps the kid on the shoulder, waits until he's got eye gaze, and then starts talking about the squirrel. This is one of those times where we as hearing people may have fantastic parenting instincts, but we may not have some of these visual instincts that deaf parents have intuitively. When we look at deaf parents and how they engage with their children, we can learn a lot. And so the project that I'm working with right now, the Family ASL project, that's exactly what they did. They looked at what deaf parents do naturally, and they compiled that into some lessons. And I'll show you a little bit more about those lessons in just a moment. But basically, before the strategies come into it, children, in order to do this natural language acquisition, they need a lot of experience. I want to remind you all It doesn't have to be perfect. That language doesn't have to be fully fluent ASL. We actually have research now that shows us that hearing parents who are still pretty new at signing are successfully supporting their children's development. So many people in this world have learned language from parents who were not fluent speakers of the language that they were acquiring or who were still acquiring the language themselves. It's not a problem. What you want to be doing is giving your child a lot of experience. Let yourself make mistakes. Your baby's brain can handle the mistakes. Give them what you can and also share your learning with them. There's a lot of language in the world that you can share with your baby. Maybe as you're learning sign language, you're not just going to put a child down in front of a sign language video and walk away, but you could watch it together. You could sign about the video. You could sign along with the video together. So language doesn't all have to be from the parent. These visual strategies that I mentioned, the Family ASL Project took work from the Deaf Leadership International Alliance, that's on the slide, and you can see a link to that, on how deaf parents engage children. And they developed some mini lessons to help parents along. And this is part of a bigger project. So the Family ASL Project actually meets with families for a year. And over the course of the year, children and parents do language games and assessments and also meet with a deaf mentor. So we have a deaf adult who meets with parents and helps language, gives them ideas, signs with their children, provides more exposure. And I've got a couple of examples of visual strategies and what visual strategies look like and how they get implemented. What you see here is a really nice picture. This is one of the families in the project, and they were kind enough to let us share their image. In the beginning, on the left here, you see the interactions before they had any instruction on visual strategies. So you can see the mom and the child are sitting side by side, and they're both kind of looking forward towards something, which is very common when hearing parents and children read a book. The child is looking down, and you don't see a lot of visual engagement. The deaf mentor worked with this mom and she said, okay, first of all, let's move your seating position. Let's move it so that you're actually face to face. And she said, okay, now you're signing and you're doing a great job, but slow it down. Slow down your sign. Wait until you've got the child looking at you. Slow down your sign and then sign it for them. And once the mom started using these new techniques, the child started producing sign. We saw a very quick and impressive change once the mom learned these tricks to make sure that they were engaging their child visually. Here's a few other sort of little hints about visual strategies. Gain attention by waving or moving yourself into the child's line of sight. Position yourself so the child can see your face and body. These may sound really obvious, and in a certain way they are, but we don't realize it as hearing people. We don't always realize it when we're not using these visual skills. And one of the things that's very important, and that came up in that squirrel video, is when you're interacting with a deaf child, give them time to look away and look back. So that shared attention that we saw in that squirrel video, those are important bonding and language moments. And when you're interacting with a deaf kid and their attention goes to something else, you need to wait until you get their eye gaze back before you can deliver the language that goes along with that shared attention. Also, maximize the things you already know about visual communication. Hearing people know how to gesture. You have learned how to gesture. Sometimes once people start learning sign language, they get anxious and they don't want to do it wrong. I want to encourage you, use the gesture you have, be creative, and think about how you talk to hearing children. When you talk to babies, most of us change our voices. We use big changes in intonation. We speak slowly, we exaggerate things. You can do the same thing with your signs, just like that father did. So slow down your signs, use big facial expression, use rhythm, use repetition. Babies and toddlers love rhythm and repetition. These are all skills you have already. You just have to think about turning them into visual engagement. I do want to acknowledge there's nothing easy about a multilingual home necessarily. It is challenging. It's hard to manage more than one language. It is also very rewarding. Many of you here may be in bilingual or multilingual homes. One of the things that works for a lot of families that are managing more than one language is to actually do language planning. And I have a resource here, some authors who wrote a really nice article about what language planning looks like in multilingual families. And as you are thinking about being a bilingual or multilingual family, it's important to remember that language mixing and switching are normal. That happens. Babies mix their languages together, adults mix their languages together. That's not a problem. That is actually normal bilingual development. But for those of us that are hearing, our voices can fool our brains really easily. So a lot of families who have both hearing and deaf members are going to sign and speak at the same time. And that makes sense. But you may not realize what is actually coming off your hands when you can hear yourself. You sound clear to yourself. You may not realize if your signs are as clear as you think they are. So I'm going to recommend plan special time that's voice off. So you can develop your family language style, but part of family language planning is saying, at dinner time, let's have dinner time be voice off. Let's everybody use only visual communication for dinner. And again, just kind of reiterating this last point, don't stress about being perfect. We are seeing very nice results that hearing parents who are signing with their children, even when they are still acquiring the language, are successfully supporting language development. I am at the end of my time now, but basically what research shows us is that babies need experience with language patterns. Spoken language is not completely accessible for deaf infants, but early sign language exposure, whatever you're going to do with them later, early sign language exposure is going to help with whatever later choices your family makes in terms of communication. I have a little bit more information, some resources here that you can feel free to check out. And I've also got my email on there, so please feel free to email me with questions. I will take any questions now if I have enough time. Let me stop sharing the screen. There's also, you'll see some resources on the slide. So all of the articles that I referenced are at the end of the slides in references. Yes, so let me see if I missed any questions. I see a nice tip here from a deaf mom saying use tactile signs. Yes, that's one of the visual strategies that we talk about in the mini lessons is signing on the child. It is a great way to get children's attention. So you will see when deaf parents are reading with their child, for example, they might sign bear on the child. So maybe the kid's sitting in their lap and they sign bear on the child. Or your kid is cranky and you're trying to say, do you want to eat? And you can't get them to look at you. So you reach over and you sign eat on their face. Do you want to eat? So yes, those tactile strategies are one of the things that deaf parents do that's very, very effective. Let's see. Someone is asking about if the slides will be provided automatically or if they should be requested. Let me put the link into the slides now. Let me just grab that link. Okay, I will just throw that into, let's see. All right, so in the Q&A, I sent a link that is these slides. But you can also let me know if you didn't get them. Okay, I am out of time and I don't want to keep people longer than you're here, but I would love to talk more about the Family ASL project if anyone is interested. You'll see some information in the slides also about the Family ASL project. I really like talking about this stuff. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And let me bring up the slides for Todd again. Let me bring up that final slide.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Blau, for a wonderful presentation. I hope that everybody enjoyed this webinar and found it very informative and beneficial. I would like to encourage all of you to sign up for our mailing list. You can use your phone to scan the QR code on the screen to sign up for our mailing list. And also, please follow us on Facebook, where we will have more information about various webinars that we're offering, different resources and events that we share periodically on there. Also, we have information about Gallaudet and the Clare Center. My office is here in Massachusetts. We have information about our office here. Thank you for coming to the webinar, and I hope you have a great rest of your night. Bye-bye.